The clasp at her throat would not close. Eliza Whitcomb stood on the stone step with 3 seconds of composure left in her, and a wind at her back that smelled of river and coming rain. And she asked the clasp, once, quietly, to behave. It did not. The little brass hook had been bent since the winter her sister Marian had caught it on a garden gate and laughed and said the coat would outlive them both. Marian had been right about the coat. She had been wrong about the rest. Inside the house, a bell had already been rung. She could hear it through the door, that mild silver sound that meant the guests were being called to move from the long gallery into the drawing room. That meant she was late. That meant she had, at most, the length of one held breath to decide whether to walk in wearing her sister's coat or to walk in wearing nothing over the plain gray silk beneath it, which was 2 seasons old and had been let out twice at the waist and would be, in this house tonight, a smaller humiliation than the coat. She chose the coat. She always chose the coat. She pressed the clasp flat against the wool with her thumb, tilted her chin the exact degree her mother had taught her before the world had learned her mother's name, only as a caution, and pushed the door. The footman did not quite meet her eye. That was not unkindness. It was, she thought, the specific, careful blindness servants offered to those whose position in the room they had not yet been told. She surrendered the coat before she could change her mind. She watched it lifted from her shoulders like something removed from an animal that had been caught, and she felt, absurdly, colder without it than she had been in the wind. Miss Whitcomb. The butler said her name the way one might name a small, unfamiliar dish placed at the edge of a large table, politely, doubtfully, ready to move on. "Yes," she said, "I am late. Please don't announce me." He inclined half a degree. She walked past him and into the light. The drawing room at Marchwood was arranged. That night, the way a chessboard is arranged at the beginning of a game one has already resolved to lose slowly and with dignity. The candles had been doubled. Someone had put out the good porcelain, the set with the pale blue rim that had belonged to the late Lady Marchwood and was, by household legend, brought down only for engagements, funerals, and one memorable winter when the vicar had been persuaded to sing. There were more men in the room than there had been at any gathering Eliza could remember, and they were not, on the whole, the men she was accustomed to seeing at Marchwood. The Earl of Havering stood by the pianoforte, which was a fact so improbable she nearly checked the wallpaper to be sure of the house. Lord Ashcombe, who had not left his estate in Yorkshire for 9 years except to bury his father, was leaning on the mantel with the mild alertness of a man who had traveled a great distance to be exactly where he now was. There were others. She counted, without meaning to, 7, 8, 9 unmarried men of consequence, each dressed with the small extra care that told a woman, if she cared to read it, that a decision had been made before the evening began. She assumed, quite naturally, that the decision concerned her cousin Frances. Of course it did. Frances Marchwood was the reason for the engagement, the reason for the porcelain, the reason for the doubled candles and the whispers she could hear settling like dust behind fans. Frances was 22, and clever, and pretty, and had a laugh that could be heard across a lawn, and Frances's father was giving a small, elegant announcement dinner to precede the more formal party the following month, and Frances's mother had written to Eliza 3 weeks ago in a hand that had trembled with the effort of civility and said, in so many words, "Come. Because it will look ungenerous if you do not, and go home early. Because it will look ungenerous if you stay." Eliza had come. She intended to go home early. She had not intended to arrive in Marian's coat, but Marian's coat was the only warm thing in the house at Little Sowerby that still fit her and did not shame her outright, and the mail carriage had been late, and she had made the calculation on the road, Better to be a woman in an unfashionable coat than a woman shivering in a hired chaise. She had made it. She was here. She had, by her own reckoning, 3 hours to survive, and then she could go upstairs to the small blue room that had once been Marion's and lie down in the dark and be no one at all until morning. She took a glass of something pale from a passing tray without tasting it and set herself, as she had been taught, at an angle that permitted retreat. Eliza, her aunt's voice arrived before her aunt did, which was efficient of it. Lady Marchwood swept toward her with the particular smile reserved for nieces who had, against expectation, appeared. You came. I did. And the smile did not falter, exactly, so much as it acquired an additional purpose, that coat. It is off now, Aunt, so it is. The eyes traveled once, downward, upward, and returned. The gray suits you. You are kind. I am not, said Lady Marchwood, with the smallest human warmth she had permitted herself all season, but tonight, my dear, I mean to be. Stand a little further from the pianoforte. The light is unforgiving there. She moved. She did not know then why her aunt had said it. She thought it was a courtesy, of the sort her aunt occasionally produced the way a magician produces a coin from a child's ear, chiefly to remind everyone that the trick was possible. She stood where she was told. She looked, out of habit, for Frances. Frances was not in the room. That was strange. That was, in fact, so strange that Eliza felt the first small movement of something under her composure, the way one feels a floor beneath a rug when the rug is thinner than one had believed. The engagement was Frances's, the dinner was Frances's, the doubled candles were Frances's. Yet Frances, who had never in her life been late to her own light, was elsewhere, and Frances's mother had placed Eliza, deliberately, in the softest, most generous fall of candlelight in the room. She did not have time to make the thought into a question. A voice at her elbow made her the question instead. Miss Whitcomb. I hoped it would be you. She turned. Lord Ashcombe, the man who did not leave Yorkshire, was looking at her with the mild alertness she had noted from across the room, only now the alertness had a name, and the name, she realized with a small internal jolt, was recognition. He had not been introduced to her. He was speaking as if he had been. Forgive me, she said. Have we? No, he said. We have not. That is the trouble I have come 300 miles to correct. She laughed, because a well-bred woman laughs when a stranger says a sentence like that at an engagement dinner, not her own, and because she did not know what else to do. The laugh was small and clean and, she noticed, unlike most of her laughs that season, entirely real. That is a great distance, she said, for a correction. It is, he said, and it is not the greatest distance in the room. He inclined his head, minutely, toward the pianoforte. The Earl of Havering, who had traveled from London, met her eyes across the candles and lifted his glass 1/4 of an inch. It was not a toast. It was, she understood with a slow, dawning cold along the back of her neck, an acknowledgement. She looked away. She looked at the doorway. She looked at the little inlaid table where the porcelain sat waiting. She looked, finally, at her aunt, who was watching her with an expression Eliza had never before been permitted to see on that face, which was the expression of a woman who has arranged a room exactly as she wished and is now, against her own reputation for coldness, hoping. Eliza Whitcomb, 26 years old, unmarried, undowered, in her sister's old coat which now hung in a cupboard behind her, understood, without yet believing, that every unmarried lord of consequence in 3 counties had come to Marchwood that night, and that not one of them had come for Frances. She did not know why. She did not yet know how. She only knew, with the clean, terrible clarity of a person who has been overlooked for a very long time and is now being looked at from every direction at once, that a decision had been made about her without her, and that the decision was already in motion, and that she had, at most, one evening to decide what she intended to do about it. She smoothed the gray silk once, at the wrist, where the seam had been let out and relet and turned. She lifted her chin the exact degree her mother had taught her. She turned back to Lord Ashcombe. "Then," she said, "you had better tell me what has been decided in my absence." He smiled. It was a small smile, entirely private, as if he had been waiting a long time to be asked a question in that particular tone. "Not here," he said. "Not yet. But before the evening is over, Miss Whitcomb, I hope you will permit me to try." Frances arrived a quarter of an hour later on her father's arm, wearing a pale rose gown and an expression Eliza knew from childhood, the expression Frances wore when she had been given a part in a play she did not understand and had decided, out of pure Francesness, to play it beautifully anyway. She kissed Eliza's cheek at the appointed moment. She murmured, very close to her ear, "Do not be frightened. Papa will explain." And Eliza, the coat was perfect. Truly, then she was gone again into the room, laughing her carrying laugh, being the daughter of the house, being, Eliza saw at last, the decoy she had agreed to be. The dinner bell rang. They went in. Eliza was seated, not below the salt, not among the modest cousins where she had sat at every Marchwood dinner of her adult life, but at the right hand of her uncle, in the chair that was, by the ancient stubborn arithmetic of English tables, the chair of the person the evening was for. She sat. She did not look at anyone. She looked at the pale blue rim of the plate before her, and counted, because counting had always steadied her, the small painted flowers around its edge. There were 12. She had known there would be 12. She had polished this plate herself 3 summers ago, in the pantry with Marian, while Marian coughed into her handkerchief and pretended she was not coughing, and told her, laughing, that one day Eliza would sit in the chair that took this plate, and Eliza had said, "Don't be foolish," and Marian had said, "I am never foolish, only early." Her uncle cleared his throat. "My friends," he said, and the room quieted with the swift, well-oiled obedience of rooms that have been quieted by that voice for 40 years. "You have come a long way, some of you. You have come, I know, on the strength of a letter I sent in confidence, and on the strength of your patience with a family that has, for reasons I shall not rehearse tonight, kept a certain matter to itself for longer than was kind." He did not look at Eliza. That was a mercy. She felt her hands go quite still in her lap. "My niece, Miss Eliza Whitcomb," he went on, "has been, these 7 years, the private steward of an estate whose name most of you will know, and whose recovery from ruin most of you will have heard credited, wrongly, to me. The credit is not mine. It has never been mine. It has been hers, from the first letter she wrote at 19 to a creditor who had every legal right to take the roof from over her mother's head, to the ledger that closed, last Michaelmas, in the black, for the 7th consecutive year. I have kept her name out of it at her request, and at her sister's, and, latterly, at my wife's, because we agreed among us that a young woman's marriage prospects were not to be sacrificed to a piece of accounting, however handsome." He paused. He looked, at last, at Eliza. His eyes were not the eyes she was used to. "We were wrong," he said. "We were wrong to hide her. And we are, tonight, correcting the wrong. Not by making a match, by ending a silence. Gentlemen, the woman on my right has saved a house, a name, and though she will not thank me for saying it, the futures of 2 younger cousins who would, without her, have had none. If any of you have come here tonight with the intention of asking her a question, you will ask it, if you ask it at all, of a woman who is now known for what she is. That is all I mean to say. Frances, my love, will you take the toast? Frances rose. Frances, who had spent an entire season pretending to be the reason for a dinner that was not hers, lifted her glass with a steadiness Eliza had not known her cousin possessed, and said, in the carrying voice of the daughter of the house, to my cousin Eliza, who is and has always been the cleverest of us, and who wore tonight our Aunt Marian's coat because she did not know we were expecting her. We are. To Eliza. The room drank. Eliza did not. She could not lift the glass her hand had, without her permission, closed around the stem with the exact pressure required to hold a thing that must not be dropped. She set the glass down. She looked, once, along the table. 9 faces looked back, and each face, she saw with a distant, almost scholarly astonishment, was composed in the particular way faces compose themselves when their owners have been given a piece of information they had suspected and are, now that it is confirmed, recalculating. Lord Ashcombe at the far end did not recalculate. He simply, minutely inclined his head, as a man does who has been proved right in a private wager with himself. She stood. Uncle, she said, and the room, which had begun to move again in its small, forgiving way, stilled once more. You are kind. You have all been kinder than I deserve. But I should like, if I may, to say one thing before the soup is served, because if I do not say it now, I shall not sleep tonight, and I have not slept badly in 7 years, and do not mean to begin. Her uncle inclined his head. Her aunt, at the far end, folded her hands on the cloth as if in church. I did not save the house, Eliza said. The house was saved by a great many people. By my sister Marian, who wrote the first letter with me, and would have written all of them if she had lived. By our steward, who is old and tired and did not tell me, until last spring, that he had been paying 2 of the maids out of his own pension because I had told him we could not afford them. By my mother, who sold, without telling me every piece of jewelry she owned except her wedding ring, and who told me, when I found the empty boxes, that she had lost them, which is a lie she has never told about anything else in her life. By my cousin Frances, who has, this whole season, allowed me to be invisible so that I might be, at the end of it, seen, and by, I confess, a certain amount of luck with wool prices, which no accountant may claim as virtue. She paused. She had not meant to say so much. She said the rest anyway, because her hand had stopped shaking and she was, for the first time in the evening, quite warm. I mention this, she said, because I have understood, in the last quarter of an hour, that some of you have come here believing you know what sort of woman I am. You do not, neither do I, yet entirely I have been a ledger for 7 years. I should like, before I am anything else, a little while to be a person. If any of you can bear the inefficiency of courting a woman who intends, first, to learn her own name again, I shall be glad to know you. If you cannot, I shall be glad to know that too. I am not, tonight, for sale. I am, tonight, at home. Uncle, forgive me. The soup. She sat. There was a silence of the length that, in that house, was the length of a decision being made by 9 men at once. Then the Earl of Havering, at the pianoforte end of the table, laughed. It was not a mocking laugh. It was the laugh of a man who has traveled a great distance to meet a rumor and has discovered, on arrival, that the rumor was an understatement, and who is, being the Earl of Havering, honest enough to admit it aloud. Marchwood, he said, you undersold her. I did, said her uncle. I meant to. I no longer do. The soup was served. The rest of the dinner was, in its way, the least interesting hour of Eliza's life, because the interesting hour had already happened, and she spent the soup and the fish and the game course learning, slowly, how to eat in a room in which she was being looked at kindly. It was harder than being looked at unkindly. It required a different set of muscles. She used the muscles. She made small, careful conversation with the man on her left, who turned out to be a widowed baronet with 3 children and a stammer he had not troubled to hide, and who told her, over the fish, that he had come chiefly to see whether she was as sensible as her uncle's letter had claimed, and that he had his answer, and that he would not press her because he had promised his eldest daughter he would not press anyone, and would she, perhaps, in the spring, permit him to send a book he thought she might like. She said yes. She meant it. She thought, with an odd small warmth, that she would like to meet a man who kept a promise made to a child. She spoke, once, across the table to Lord Ashcombe. She asked him, because she had been curious since the hall, what the correction was that had required 300 miles. He said, without looking away, that he had inherited a neighboring estate the previous autumn, and that the ledgers had been in a condition he was not equal to, and that he had heard, through a chain of acquaintances that began with her uncle's steward and ended with his own, that there was a woman in the South who had, quietly and without name, taught herself the thing he now needed to learn, and that he had come to ask, not for her hand, but for her advice, and that if the advice, in the giving, turned into an acquaintance, and the acquaintance, in the keeping, turned into anything more, he would consider the 300 miles the best he had ever spent. And if it did not, he would consider them still well spent, because he would at least have met her. He said all of this in the same mild, alert tone in which he had spoken in the hall, as if he were reading a passage he had prepared on the road, and was relieved, at last, to have delivered. She did not know what to say. She said, after a moment, that she would be glad to look at his ledgers. She meant that too. She did not know. Sitting there with her hands quiet in her lap and the pale blue rim of Marian's plate before her, which of these men, if any, she would come to know. She only knew that the room, which had been arranged like a chessboard, was no longer a chessboard, because she had, without meaning to, stepped off the board and become a player, and the players had, without quite meaning to themselves, agreed to it. After dinner, in the drawing-room, her aunt drew her aside behind the screen where the fire was lowest and said, without preamble, "Marian made me promise." Eliza waited. On the day she died, her aunt said, and her voice, which had never in Eliza's hearing wavered now. She made me promise that when the ledgers closed for the 7th year, she was very particular about the 7th year. She said 7 was the year a thing became true. I would take the coat off you. I have failed at a great many promises in my life, Eliza. I did not intend to fail at that one. Forgive me the theater. It was the only way I knew to do it that would let you keep your pride. Eliza did not weep. She had not wept since the winter Marian had died, and she had discovered, in weeping, that she did not have the leisure for it. She did not weep now. She took her aunt's hand, which was cold and dry and, she realized with a small pang, older than she had noticed, and she held it for the length of one long breath and one short one, and she said, "You have not failed." Her aunt nodded once and turned away, because Marchwood women, on the whole, did not permit themselves more than one long breath and one short one at a time, and Eliza, who was one of them whether she had noticed or not, let her go. Frances came and stood beside her at the window. They looked, together, at the dark garden and the wet gravel and the lamps at the gate. "Was I terrible," Frances said, "at being you?" You were terrible, Eliza said. You laughed too much. I knew it, said Frances, delighted. I told Mama I laughed too much. She said no one would notice. She was wrong. I always laugh too much when I am pretending. Cousin, marry whoever you like. Marry no one. I do not care. Only promise me you will burn that coat. I will not, said Eliza. It is a good coat. It is a hideous coat. It is Marian's. Ah, said Frances, and did not argue. They stood a little longer. The rain began, at last, in the small, considerate way of English rain that has been threatening for hours and is, in the end, embarrassed by its own delay. Somewhere behind them, someone was playing, badly and with great feeling, a piece on the pianoforte that Marian had used to play well. Word, in the months that followed, went where word goes. The widowed baronet sent the book in the spring, with a note in a careful hand that had plainly been drafted 3 times, and a postscript in a rounder hand that read, in the unmistakable print of a 9-year-old, Papa says you are sensible. Are you also kind? Please write. Eliza wrote. The correspondence, in the way of such correspondences, became a friendship, and the friendship, in the way of such friendships, remained one, because the baronet's eldest daughter, upon meeting Eliza in the autumn, declared her sensible and kind, and also, unfortunately for her father, more like an aunt than a mother, and the baronet, who had the sense to listen to his children, accepted the diagnosis with grace and gained, that winter, a cousin. Lord Ashcombe's ledgers turned out to be less desperate than he had feared, and more instructive than he had hoped, and Eliza went, in June, to Yorkshire, chaperoned by an alarmed and delighted Frances, and stayed a fortnight, and left with an understanding that was not yet an engagement, and was, by both their preferences, better than one, being a thing they had agreed to build slowly and in daylight. The Earl of Havering, honest to the last, wrote once to say that he had thought, on the road home, a great deal about the woman who had told a table of lords that she was not for sale, and had concluded that she was also, alas, not for him, being too much herself for a house as loud as his, and that he wished her. With real feeling, a quieter man, he married, the following spring, a widow with 4 grown sons and a laugh like a bell, and was, by all accounts, happy. Frances married, in her own time and for her own reasons, a country doctor whom her mother pretended not to approve of and secretly adored, and laughed too much at the wedding, on purpose, because she said she had earned it. The steward at Little Sowerby was quietly pensioned into a cottage on the estate, with a view of the river and a standing weekly invitation to tea, which he accepted, always, and complained about, always, and never once missed. Eliza's mother, who had sold the jewelry, wore, at Eliza's own wedding 2 years later, a small string of pearls that had arrived, without a card, from a house in Yorkshire, and which she pretended, out of long habit, that she had always owned, and the coat, which Eliza did not burn, hung for many years in a cedar cupboard at Ashcombe, and was taken out, once, on the coldest night of a particular winter, and laid, without ceremony, over the shoulders of a girl of 13, who had walked 3 miles in the wet, because she had heard there was a lady in the great house who kept the accounts herself, and might teach a girl to do the same. The girl kept the coat. Eliza did not ask for it back. And now, if you have sat with me this long by the fire, let me say this, gently, before I go. If you have ever walked into a room in something borrowed, believing you were the smallest person in it, and found, by some grace you had not asked for, that you were the reason the candles had been doubled. If you have ever spent 7 quiet years being useful in a house that would not say your name, and wondered whether anyone had noticed, if you have ever suspected, in the private, stubborn part of yourself, that the work you have done in the dark has been seen, after all, by more eyes than you knew, then this story was, in some small way, yours. Tell me, if you will, which moment stayed with you? Was it the clasp at the door that would not close? Was it the plate with the 12 painted flowers? Was it Francis laughing too much on purpose? Was it the aunt's cold hand, held for one long breath and one short? Sit with me a little longer, if you can. There is always another story waiting at the edge of the firelight, and the fire, as you see, is in no hurry. Come back when the wind is loud and the world is thin, and pull up the chair beside mine, and we will find another quiet life that turned. One evening on a coat that would not fasten. Until then, be gentle with yourself and be seen. Good night, my dear. Good night.